Jonah Grayson, a mountain rescue veteran living deep in Idaho's Sierra Pines, thought he was just following his husky's instincts when Storm suddenly bolted into the rising snowstorm. But the dog wouldn't stop. He kept barking, circling, clawing at the ground as if begging Jonah to hurry. And then Jonah saw it. A young woman in a torn wedding dress, shivering uncontrollably in the freezing wind, stranded in a broken wheelchair in the middle of the forest. Her lips blue, her eyes. Storm wasn't the only thing she was running from. Winter came early to the high country that year, rolling down off the broken spine of the Sawtooth Range like a slow white tide, swallowing the last rust of autumn grass and the dirt tracks that threaded through the pines. Up here in the backcountry of Sierra Pines, Idaho, there were only two kinds of sound when the snow started to fall: the far-off freight train growl of the wind moving through the canyons, and the kind of silence that made a man hear every ghost he thought he'd left behind. Jonah Grayson had chosen that silence on purpose 3 years ago and had been paying for it ever since, living alone in a weather-beaten cabin of hand-hewn logs that sat on a small rise above a frozen creek, a dark knot of human stubbornness against a world that didn't much care if he stayed or went. He was in his late 30s, but carried himself like a man older, the kind of older that came from body counts and bad news, not birthdays. Tall and raw-boned from years of mountain rescue work, he had shoulders thick from swinging ropes and hauling stretchers, and hands like worn leather that had known both the warmth of saving lives and the cold of not getting there in time. A sun-faded brown leather jacket hugged his frame, creased and scarred in all the places that matched the long faded lines on his skin. Beneath it, he wore a denim shirt the color of worn sky, buttons chipped, cuffs frayed, tucked into jeans that had seen as many winters as his truck. A black felt hat, the broad-brimmed kind the old cowhands favored, sat low over dark hair threaded with premature silver at the temples, and his beard, kept short out of habit more than vanity, couldn't quite hide the thin, white mark along his jaw, a gift from rockfall on a rescue gone sideways up in the Bitterroots. But none of those marks were the ones that changed him. That honor belonged to a late March storm 3 years back and a phone call from a hospital 4 hours away, the night his wife, Mara, slid off an icy road on her way back from town and never made it home. Since then, Jonah had figured out how to move and breathe and eat without her. But anybody who looked close enough at his gray-green eyes could see the hollowed-out places where laughter used to live. He worked odd seasonal jobs, fixed fences for neighbors who lived miles away, and otherwise kept his world boiled down to 3 simple things: wood, weather, and the dog at his side. The dog's name was Storm, and he was the kind of husky that made tourists stop in gas station lots just to stare. 4 years old, built lean but strong like a piece of running creek brought to life, his coat was a striking wash of silver and white with darker charcoal shadows along his spine and around his ice-blue eyes, as if someone had traced eyeliner there by hand. Storm moved with the contained energy of an animal half wild and half home, trotting close at Jonah's heel when they were on the road, but ranging ahead in wide, loose circles when they were on the land, nose to the wind, ears twitching at sounds Jonah hadn't heard yet. He was no pampered house pet. He had slept in snow caves and on cold truck beds, had learned the difference between the crack of a tree limb and the warning roll of distant thunder, and had stayed pressed against Jonah's legs the night Mara didn't come back, watching his human crumble without making a sound. Since then, Storm had become something more than a dog. He was the last living witness to the life Jonah had lost, and the only creature Jonah trusted without reservation. The animal's instincts had pulled them both out of bad situations more than once, and somewhere along the way, Jonah had started listening when storms stiffened or growled at empty air, like the mountains themselves were whispering through that thick gray fur. On that particular afternoon, the sky over Sierra Pines had the heavy, low-slung look Jonah had learned to fear during his years with the county search and rescue team. A flat sheet of iron-gray cloud pressing down on the jagged line of ridges to the west. The temperature had dropped steadily since morning, and now the air had that sharp metallic tang that said snow was no longer a question, but a promise. The tops of the lodgepole pines were already smoothing under a dusting of white, and the wind had picked up just enough to lift loose granules of old snow along the ground like blown sand. Jonah had thrown on his jacket, shouldered his battered canvas backpack, heavy as sin and twice as stubborn, stuffed with the things a man might need if the world decided to tilt without warning, and stepped out from the cabin to walk his usual perimeter before dark, Storm trotting along in his shadow. It was a ritual as much as a chore. Check the old game trail that sometimes turned into a trespasser's shortcut, make sure the half-fallen spruce near the creek hadn't finally surrendered, listen to the land in that quiet hour before the real cold settled in. The world was all muted colors and long blue shadows, and if not for the bark of a raven overhead or the crunch of his boots in the thin crust of snow, Jonah could almost believe he'd walked clean out of time. He was halfway through the loop, mind drifting in that strange, loose way it did out here, half inventorying his firewood, half remembering the way Mara used to hum off-key while cooking, when he felt, more than saw, Storm change. One moment the husky was pacing easily, tail held in a loose curve, nose busy with the ordinary business of scents and tracks. The next, his entire body went still, as if some invisible hand had snapped a line tight inside him. His head came up, ears pitched forward, eyes locked not on Jonah, but on something deeper between the trees where the light was already thinning. A low sound rolled up from the dog's chest, not a showy bark, but a quiet, warning growl that seemed to vibrate in Jonah's ribs. "Easy, boy," Jonah muttered, but his own. A hand had already slid to the strap of his pack out of habit, fingers brushing the cold metal of the small emergency beacon clipped there. Storm didn't look at him. Instead, with a sudden, explosive burst of movement, the husky launched forward into the gathering dim, snow spraying from under his paws like he'd been yanked by an invisible rope. "Storm!" Jonah's voice snapped through the trees, but the dog only glanced back once, a flash of blue eyes full of urgency, before disappearing between the dark trunks. For a heartbeat, Jonah stood there, torn between the cautious man he'd become and the one who used to charge into blizzards for strangers. And then muscle memory chose for him. He hitched his pack higher on his shoulder and took off after Storm, boots punching through the thin upper crust of snow into the soft powder beneath. The forest closed around him in a blur of black bark and white branches, the wind carrying fine ice into his beard, but he kept his eyes fixed on the blur of motion ahead, Storm's tail whipping like a flag just before it vanished again. They ran that way for what felt like a long time, but was probably only a few minutes, dipping down into a shallow hollow Jonah didn't remember noticing before, where the snow lay deeper and the air somehow felt heavier, as if they'd stepped into a pocket of the world the storm had been saving for itself. Then Storm stopped so abruptly Jonah almost collided with him. The husky stood rigid at the edge of a small clearing, fur along his spine raised, paws planted in the snow as though he'd grown there. His eyes were fixed on the center of the opening, and when Jonah followed that gaze, the rest of the world fell away. There, in a ring of trampled, churned-up snow, sat a wheelchair that looked as if it belonged in an old hospital museum, all rusted iron and worn leather, its right wheel twisted at an ugly angle. In the chair, hunched against a wind that knifed through the trees, was a young woman in a wedding dress. The white lace of the gown, once probably bright and intricate, was now soaked through at the hem and speckled with mud and ice, clinging to her legs in miserable folds. The sleeves fell off her shoulders, leaving pale skin exposed to the cold, and she had her arms crossed tight over her chest, more out of instinct than effectiveness. Her dark hair, the rich brown of wet earth, hung in tangled strands around her face, and her lips had gone the faint bluish color Jonah had seen too many times on people they'd pulled out of ravines and rivers. She looked up at him as he stepped into the clearing, and in her eyes he saw something that wasn't quite the wild panic of someone newly lost. It was older than that, a kind of exhausted terror, like a deer that had been running for days and finally hit the fence. For a brief, strange second, Jonah's first thought was that she looked like she'd been dropped there by some cruel hand, an offering to the cold. "Hey," he said, voice coming out rougher than he meant. "Ma'am?" The word felt strange in his mouth after so much time speaking mostly to trees and one stubborn dog. Her chin trembled, and tears, half frozen, shone on her lashes. When she tried to speak, the first sound that came out was a broken sob, and then the words tumbled after, ragged and stumbling. I'm sorry," she gasped, as if apologizing for existing. I didn't think anyone was out here." Storm moved first. The husky, who would stand his ground against a black bear and had once nearly torn the bumper off a truck because it backfired too close to Jonah, took 2 slow steps forward, head low, ears tipped back in a posture Jonah recognized as something like canine concern. He sniffed the air between them, then the hem of her dress, then, with a soft, questioning whine, nudged his cold nose against the back of her hand where it clutched at her shoulder. Her fingers flinched, then relaxed just enough for him to touch, and Jonah watched a tiny bit of the rigidity leave her posture at that simple contact, like the dog had given her permission to keep breathing. "What happened?" Jonah asked, eyes already cataloging details the way he used to on call-outs, the way her teeth chattered so hard the words had trouble forming, the ugly bend in the wheelchair's wheel, the absence of any visible blood. Close up, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, late 20s, maybe early 30s, with a fine-boned face that might have been beautiful in another setting, somewhere with warmth and music instead of wind and iron and fear. She swallowed, throat working, and forced the words out between shivers. "My name is Ilara Brooks." The name sounded out of place among the pines, like it belonged on engraved invitations and hotel marquees. We were supposed to be married today, in town." Her eyes flicked down at the ruined dress, and a small, almost hysterical laugh escaped her before turning into a cough. "He wanted a mountain wedding. Said it would be epic." The last word came out with a bitterness that cut through the cold. Jonah's jaw tightened as he waited. People told strangers things in the wild they'd never say anywhere else, maybe because the trees felt like better witnesses than other humans. "We argued," she continued, voice cracking. "I told him I couldn't do it. Not like this. Not the way he wanted. The guest list, the press, the deals after." Her fingers dug into the lace at her arms like she was trying to peel the whole day off her skin. "He said I was ungrateful, that I was ruining everything. I told him I'd rather call the whole thing off." Her gaze slid to the broken wheel, then away. "He snapped, pushed me while I was in the chair. It hit a rock and that happened." The memory clearly hurt more than the fall itself. "Then he took the truck, took the phone, left me, here to think about it." She tried to square her shoulders as she said it, but they only hunched tighter against the wind. As she spoke, Jonah's eyes weren't just on her. They swept the clearing, the tree line, the way the snow lay. Years of moving through winter storms had trained him to read the land like a slow, unfolding story, and what he saw now didn't make much sense. The snowfall was fresh, but not so deep that it should have erased all trace of passage. Still, there were no tire tracks leading in or out, no churn of footprints beyond the small circle around the wheelchair where she'd clearly tried to move and failed. It was as if she'd been wheeled into place, and then the mountain had closed over the path behind her. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature crept along his spine. He turned his face slightly into the wind, listening. There was only the low moan of air through branches and the faint creak of ice forming on distant boulders. No engine, no voices, no echo of laughter carried on the cold. Just them. The man who'd tried to disappear, the dog who refused to let him, and the bride who'd been left behind. Storm glanced back at Jonah then, as if checking in, and in that look Jonah felt the old tug he'd followed 100 times on mountainsides when a dog's nose knew more than a man's eyes. This is real. This is now. This is yours to handle. Jonah didn't trust people anymore, not really. He'd seen too much of what desperation and ego and grief could do. But he trusted Storm. If the dog had dragged him half a mile through thickening snow to this woman and then offered her his comfort, that counted for something. Ilara's shivering had worsened, the fine tremors in her jaw turning into full-body shakes that made the rusted frame of the chair rattle softly. The storm, building above them, wasn't going to wait for anyone's feelings to sort themselves out. Jonah stepped closer, snow squeaking under his boots, and shrugged his pack off one shoulder. "All right," he said quietly, more to the wind and the dog and the mountains than to the woman. But her eyes latched onto the sound like it was a handhold. "We're not staying out here." She blinked at him, disbelief and something like fear warring in her gaze. You live nearby?" "Cabin's a ways back," he replied. "Warm, wood stove, better than freezing to death in a party dress." He spoke bluntly on purpose. Sometimes plain words cut through panic faster than soft ones. For a heartbeat, she looked like she might argue, that some leftover shard of pride might make her refuse help from a stranger in the woods. But another gust of wind tore through the clearing, flinging fine snow into her face, and whatever protest she'd been forming died on her lips. Jonah didn't wait for permission he already had. He swung the pack fully off, set it in the snow, and stepped up beside the chair. "I'm going to lift you," he said, keeping his tone even. "You'll be cold for a minute, and then less cold. You understand?" Her eyes flooded, but she nodded. I don't want to be alone here," she whispered, and the way she said here made Jonah think she meant more than just this clearing. "You're not," he answered, and before she could break again, he slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. For all the layers of lace and cloth, she felt light, frighteningly so, more like an abandoned garment than a person. She sucked in a sharp breath at the movement, clutching at the front of his jacket, fingers finding the worn leather as if it were the only solid thing in her universe. Storm trotted in close, circling once, then falling into step at Jonah's side. Jonah glanced once more around the clearing, at the empty tree line, the broken chair, the faint impression of wheels half filled with snow, and felt that old, familiar tightening in his chest he used to get right before a helicopter lifted off with a patient and left him on the mountain. Something had happened here that didn't sit right. Something he didn't have time to unravel with the sky lowering and the air getting sharper. The mystery would have to wait. The living came first. He bent his head against the first real teeth of the storm, adjusted his hold on Ilara Brooks, and stepped back the way he'd come, boots breaking trail through the deepening snow, while Storm pressed close to his knee, the three of them moving together into the white, back toward the lonely cabin that had only ever been built for one. Jonah pushed through the deepening snow, with Alara cradled against his chest, while Storm broke a narrow trail ahead, the dog's plume of a tail cutting arcs in the gathering dusk like a silver banner guiding them home. By the time they reached the cabin, night had fully settled over Sierra pines, wrapping the forest in a darkness soft as fur but edged with the kind of cold that could hollow a man from the inside out. Jonah kicked the door open with his boot, not out of drama but necessity. The warped pine had always stuck when the temperature dropped, and stepped into the dim interior where the familiar musk of smoke, old pine sap, and worn leather greeted him like an old, indifferent friend. He carried Alara to the battered armchair closest to the stone hearth, a seat molded by years of solitude, and lowered her there with a gentleness that surprised even him. Storm shook off the snow in a violent shudder, sending a spray of white crystals across the floorboards before settling himself directly beside her, his body angled protectively, as if he'd been appointed her guardian by some unseen judge. Jonah moved without speaking, striking a match to the kindling in the hearth. Flames flared, first uncertain and then steady, casting a warm glow across the cabin's interior. Wooden walls hung with coils of rescue rope, ice axes dull with years, carabiners worn down to ghostly smudges, memorials of a life lived on cliff faces and in storm-broken ravines. Above the mantel sat 4 weathered photographs of Mara, each frozen smile a blade that pressed into him when he least expected. Jonah felt the familiar ache, not sharp anymore, but deep, like a bruise on the soul that refused to fade. He shoved the kettle onto the stove, poured in water from the tin pitcher, and turned to see Alara staring around the cabin with a kind of dazed wonder. She looked different in firelight, less like a half-frozen apparition and more like a woman torn between 2 worlds, the one she had run from and the one she'd stumbled into by accident or fate. Her dress, though tattered, glowed faintly in the amber light, and her brown eyes flickered with reflections of the flame, half fear, half gratitude. Jonah handed her a mug of coffee, black, steaming, bitter as winter nights. She wrapped her hands around it, inhaling the warmth as though it were the first real breath she'd taken in hours. "Thank you," she whispered, voice hoarse not just from cold but from a deeper exhaustion. Jonah said nothing, only nodded once before crouching to examine the twisted wheel of the old chair. His fingers traced the cold metal, noting the angle of the bend, the cracks along the spokes, damage consistent not with time but with force, something he refused to name aloud. Storm's blue eyes followed his hands, ears pricked, as though he too was piecing together the shape of a story still half buried. "It's beyond fixing tonight," Jonah finally murmured. "You'll need rest." Alara nodded, and though she tried to hide it, her eyes darted away from the chair, her guilt rising like steam off thawing ice. She pulled the folded blanket Jonah offered around herself, pressing its woolen weight against her chest like armor. Storm shifted closer, nose brushing the lace hem of her dress, then her wrist. His soft whine wove through the cabin, a question without words. Alara stiffened. Storm had a way of looking into people rather than at them, and it unsettled her more than the storm outside. She felt as if he were reading the truth she carried, the truth she wasn't ready to speak. She could stand. She could walk. She could leave that chair at any time, but lies, once spoken, grew teeth. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the dog's gaze. Jonah didn't notice the turmoil. He was stirring a pot on the stove. The aroma of vegetables simmered with scraps of venison rising through the cabin. He cooked the way some men prayed, quietly, methodically, with all the years of practice that came from feeding yourself because no one else would. When he set the bowl before her, Elara hesitated, not because she wasn't hungry, she was starving, but because no one had made her a meal with this kind of quiet care in a very long time. "Eat," Jonah said simply. She did, and with each spoonful, warmth uncoiled in her chest like a thaw beginning under frost. But guilt sat beside her like a shadow. She thought of Vincent, of the chaos of the wedding morning, of shouting and slammed doors and being shoved into a chair she didn't need, of wanting just one sign he loved her for who she was rather than for the contracts her family name carried. Faking paralysis had been a reckless test, a desperate one, but she hadn't imagined how quickly love could turn to cruelty. Jonah watched her without watching her, the way men who've known grief learn to see everything without letting their gaze linger long enough to invite questions. He noticed the way her fingers trembled against the spoon, the way her shoulders hunched, not in cold, but in shame, though he didn't know its source. He noticed, too, how Storm kept angling his body between them, tail sweeping slowly, uncertainly, as if trying to decide whether Elara was someone to protect or someone Jonah needed protection from. Outside, the wind scraped against the shutters, a long, mournful sound that threaded through the gaps in the timber. Jonah added another log to the fire, sparks lifting like fireflies before dying in the dark. "The storm will get worse," he said quietly. "You'll stay here tonight." Elara looked into the flames. "I didn't plan to be here at all." Jonah didn't answer. He understood better than most that life didn't much care for plans. He remembered a time when Mara had told him she wanted a spring wedding with a lilac bouquet, and how a rock slide had nearly taken that future. Plans were fragile things. When the meal was finished, Jonah cleaned up with the same rugged efficiency he applied to everything. Elara's eyelids grew heavy in the fire's glow, her body no longer shaking with cold but with the overwhelming release of survival. Jonah brought out a spare quilt and laid it over the cracked leather armchair as Storm circled twice at her feet before lying down, his head lifted just enough to keep watch. "Get some sleep," Jonah murmured. "You're safe here." The words should have comforted her. Instead, her chest tightened. Safe wasn't the same as honest. She murmured a soft thank you and let her head fall back, though sleep came with difficulty. Every time she drifted, the image of Jonah lifting her from the wheelchair, his steady breath, his steadier hands, rose to the surface and twisted her insides with something she didn't have a name for. Storm's breathing grew slow and rhythmic, the dog slipping into a vigilant half-sleep, ears twitching at every creak. Jonah sat at the table repairing a torn strap on his pack, each pull of the needle whispering through the dim cabin until, little by little, the sounds softened into the hush of night. Finally, when the fire had burned low and the kettle let out a tired sigh, Elara surrendered to sleep. Jonah glanced over, expecting the uneasy rest of someone who feared what dawn might bring, but instead found her face softened, her hand resting loosely near Storm's fur, her breath calm. Something eased in him, just slightly, like the mountains themselves had shifted by a hair. The trust forming between them was small, a coal barely glowing beneath ash, but in a land where the cold could kill, even a small heat mattered. Jonah exhaled slowly, letting the quiet settle around all three of them as the storm outside roared like an old god beating against the world. And somewhere deep in the valley, unseen but felt, something in their fates began to braid together, delicate as frost, and just as impossible to undo. Morning came reluctantly to Sierra Pines, dragging pale light across the snow-packed clearing outside the cabin, the kind of thin, tired dawn that seemed unsure whether it wanted to brighten the world or turn back and let winter swallow it whole. A faint plume of smoke curled from the chimney, steady as a heartbeat, and inside, the fire Jonah had banked the night before glowed beneath ash like an ember remembering its purpose. Ilara stirred in the armchair before she opened her eyes, already aware of the silence pressing around her. Not threatening, just dense, the kind that filled all the spaces between thoughts. Storm lay curled at her feet, one blue eye cracked open, watching her with an intensity that made her feel as though the dog knew every secret she had ever tried to bury. Jonah stood near the window, coffee mug in hand, staring out at the pine-studded ridge where the rising light etched long shadows between the trees. He looked calm, but there was always something locked tight behind his expression, like a man used to carrying weight far heavier than words. When he finally turned, he gave Ilara a small nod, not unkind but reserved, as if careful not to intrude on whatever dreams she might have struggled through. "There's food on the stove," he said. "Eat when you're ready." She whispered a thank you, her voice threadbare from sleep and guilt. Jonah moved to the table and began checking the edge of a hatchet, running his thumb along the blade as though reacquainting himself with a familiar companion. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable, merely fragile, like a truce neither had officially agreed to but both relied on to breathe. When Ilara finished eating, Jonah asked softly, "You warm enough?" She nodded, though her fingers fidgeted in the blanket draped across her lap. Jonah followed her gaze, not toward him, but toward the cabin door and the 3 wooden steps beyond it. They were ordinary steps, the kind that creaked when the snow melted and swelled the boards, but the way Ilara looked at them was anything but ordinary. Her stare wasn't longing or fear exactly. It was something more complicated, threaded with a yearning he didn't understand and a sorrow he couldn't name. Jonah didn't ask about it. He wasn't the kind of man who pried. Experience had taught him people revealed things in their own time, and forcing the truth only made it run deeper underground. Instead, he set his mug down, pulled his hat from the peg, and said, almost to himself, "I'll be back." Then he stepped outside, letting the cold swallow him whole. Ilara watched him cross the yard, boots punching through the old snow toward the small shed tucked beneath a cluster of pines. The shed was little more than a lean-to with a crooked roof, but it housed Jonah's tools, the ones he used when the world needed fixing more than he did. The sound of sawing and hammering began almost immediately, sharp and purposeful, rising and falling in steady rhythm, each strike punctuating the quiet like an answer to a question she hadn't dared to ask. Storm repositioned himself beside her, tail thumping once as if to reassure her he shared the secret she was trying so desperately to hide. She reached down and brushed her fingers through his fur. The dog pressed his head into her palm, warm and solid, and something inside her cracked a little more. 2 hours later, Jonah returned, carrying a length of sturdy, slanted wood, simple, unpolished, but built with the same care he applied to everything that mattered. Without ceremony, he placed the ramp against the steps, wedging it until the fit was seamless. He dusted the snow from his gloves, then stepped back. "There," he said. "Now you can get some air." The words were plain, almost gruff, but the gesture behind them was enormous. Ilara's throat closed. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Tears stung her eyes, not from hurt, but from the unbearable kindness of a man who asked for nothing in return. She swallowed hard. "Jonah, thank you." He shrugged, though his gaze softened for a heartbeat before he turned away. Everybody deserves to step outside. Storm trotted past them and sniffed the ramp, tail wagging once, a small benediction. Ilara maneuvered the damaged chair closer, though she didn't dare place her weight on the broken wheel. Jonah steadied the chair without being asked, and together they eased her onto the porch. The sky stretched wide and impossibly blue, unmarred by clouds, the kind of mountain sky that made a person feel both insignificant and fiercely alive. The cold was sharp, yes, but also cleansing, stripping the world down to its bones. Illyra breathed it in. For the first time since the nightmare of her wedding day began, she felt something like freedom brushing against her skin, cold, bright, terrifying. Jonah watched her from the corner of his eye, sensing there was more beneath that flicker of relief than she let on. He didn't know her story, not all of it, but he recognized the look of someone trying to rebuild themselves from the inside out. Storm sat between them, leaning slightly into Illyra's leg, his tail brushing Jonah's boot in quiet contentment. The three stood like that for a long moment, each anchored to the others by something invisible and tenuous. But beneath Illyra's gratitude was a knot of dread. Every kindness Jonah showed her twisted that knot tighter, because he didn't know the truth. Not yet. As the sun dipped toward the ridge, Jonah headed inside to stoke the fire. Illyra followed slowly, Storm at her heel. When Jonah finally drifted off to sleep later that night, slumped in the chair closest to the hearth, the weight of the day wearing him down, Illyra sat in silence, staring at the ramp visible through the frost-rimmed window. She stood. It wasn't a decision so much as a necessity, a breath she had held too long finally escaping. Her legs trembled from hours of disuse, but they held. She pressed a hand to the table for balance, then took a step. Storm lifted his head instantly, ears forward, eyes bright with recognition rather than alarm. He padded toward her, nose nudging her thigh, a soft huff of approval leaving his chest. "No," she whispered, voice shaking. "Don't. Please don't." But Storm wagged his tail, delighted, as if he'd known all along that she was more capable than she pretended. She took one more step, then another, and with each movement the lie she'd woven tightened into something unbearable. She felt sick with it, the weight pressing against her ribs. Behind her the floorboards creaked. Illyra froze. Jonah stood in the shadows near the hearth, eyes fixed on her, not on the trembling of her knees but on the unmistakable truth of her standing. The fire behind him cast a thin rim of light along his shoulders, but his face remained unreadable. Not angry, not shocked, just closed. Closed in a way that told her something delicate had fractured beyond repair. "Jonah, The words died as soon as they left her mouth. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't hurl accusations or demand explanations. He simply stepped back into the darker part of the room, withdrawing like a man who had touched a flame he should have known would burn him. Storm looked between them, confused, tail lowering, the air thick with a pain he could sense but couldn't decipher. Illyra felt something inside her crumble, collapsing under the weight of her choices. Jonah didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The distance between them said everything. And in that stillness, as the storm outside groaned against the cabin walls, Illyra understood the full cost of her lie. Not in anger, but in the heartbreak of a man retreating into the wilderness inside himself, a place she feared she no longer had the right to follow. Morning crept into the cabin like a reluctant guest, pale light sliding across the wooden floorboards and resting on the cold spot where Illyra had stood the night before, her secret laid bare in the stillness between them. Jonah hadn't slept, not truly. He had spent the hours after discovering her walking the tight line between anger and something far sharper, something close to betrayal, though he didn't dare name it. The fire had burned low, casting a dull orange glow that flickered across his face but failed to thaw the stone his expression had become. When Illyra finally rose from the couch, her breath trembled in the cold, her hands twisting in the blanket she had wrapped around herself. Storm watched her with quiet worry, his head tilting as if he sensed she was on the verge of breaking apart. Jonah didn't move when she approached him. He stood near the table, shoulders rigid, his jaw tight enough to crack. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak, far enough to respect the bristling boundary he had drawn in the air. "Jonah," she whispered, voice thin as smoke. "Please, let me explain." His silence stretched, long and unforgiving, until at last he said, softly but with an edge that cut clean through her, "You lied. Whatever reason you have, you still lied." She swallowed, tears burning behind her lashes. "I pretended I couldn't walk because I needed a way out. Vincent, my fiancé, he wasn't what people saw. He controlled everything, my clothes, my friends, my job, my name. Every choice I made had to be verified, approved, reshaped to fit his version of who I should be. Saying no wasn't an option anymore. And when I finally did," her voice cracked, "he left me in the forest with a broken chair to prove what my life would look like without him." Jonah's jaw twitched, but he still wouldn't look at her. She pressed on, as though her truth was the only thing holding her upright. "I wasn't testing you. I wasn't playing a game. I was running. And I panicked. Pretending to be helpless felt like the only shield I had left." Jonah exhaled, the sound rough and tired. "You turned suffering into a tool," he said. "Do you know what that looks like to someone who's lived it?" His eyes flickered, just briefly, with a shadow Elara didn't understand. Something old and jagged. Something he didn't speak of. She felt her heart fold in on itself. "I know," she whispered. "I know what I've done. I broke something in here I can't fix. And that's why." Her voice crumbled, and she turned away so he wouldn't see the tears spilling over. "That's why I'm leaving." Storm whimpered, stepping toward her as though to block her path. She knelt, pressing a trembling hand to his fur. "I'm sorry, Storm," she said softly. "You deserved the truth. You saw me when I didn't even see myself." The dog nudged her cheek as if trying to keep her in place, refusing to believe this was the end. Jonah stood, unmoving, as she walked past him, movements slow and deliberate, like someone wading through waist-deep sorrow. She went to the small table beneath the window, the one Jonah never used except to sort mail and sharpen tools, and pulled a sheet of paper from his drawer. The pen shook in her grip, but she wrote. She wrote everything she couldn't say aloud. Her fear, her loneliness, her gratitude, her regret. She wrote about the way the cabin had felt like a heartbeat in the storm, about the way Jonah's quiet kindness had stitched her back together in places she didn't know were torn. She wrote about Storm, the dog who trusted her long before she deserved it. And she ended the letter not with a plea, but with a hope, that he might someday forgive himself for pushing people away. When she folded the paper, her hands lingered on it as though it were the last tether she had to this strange, healing place she was about to abandon. Before she left, she placed a small red rubber ball beside the letter, the only gift she had been able to offer Storm. She had seen the way he stared at a similar one in an old catalog Jonah kept. A silly thing, perhaps, but something that carried a piece of her heart. Then she slipped silently from the cabin, the door shutting with the softest click, a sound that broke something inside Storm. The husky whined, then pushed his nose against the door, pawing at it in confusion. By the time Jonah returned from the shed an hour later, hands cold, shoulders dusted with snow, Storm was pacing anxiously, tail low, ears flattened. The instant Jonah stepped inside, Storm rushed him, then spun toward the table, barking once, a sharp, desperate sound. Jonah frowned, brushing past him. The cabin felt wrong the moment he entered. The air too still, too hollow. Storm nudged Jonah again, this time pressing his nose against the table leg. Jonah followed the gesture and froze. The letter sat there, neatly folded, weighted with a smooth river stone he kept for no real reason other than he liked the feel of it. Beside it, the flash of red caught his eye. A dog toy. A ball. The kind Storm had watched longingly months ago. Jonah's breath caught. He picked up the letter first, not daring to open it yet. His fingers hovered over the crease. Storm, desperate to communicate in the only way he knew, grabbed the red ball gently in his mouth and dropped it into Jonah's hand. His tail wagged, slow at first, then faster, as though saying, "She left, but she cared." Jonah stared at the ball, its weight startlingly real, startlingly warm from Storm's muzzle. Something cracked inside him, deeper than anger, deeper than disappointment. It was the sound of grief bending toward something softer. He sank into the chair, elbows on his knees, the letter trembling slightly between his fingers. The fire hissed softly. Storm pressed his head against Jonah's leg, offering silent comfort. Jonah bowed his head, eyes burning for the first time in years, not because he had been deceived, but because somewhere in the vast winter of his life, he had allowed someone in. And now she was gone, and all that remained was a letter, a red ball, and the echo of everything they might have been. 3 weeks reshaped Sierra Pines in ways only spring could. Slowly, at first, with hesitant drips from the high branches. Then, all at once, as the snow softened into rivulets carving down the slopes like silver threads. The land that had held its breath through winter now exhaled, releasing the damp, earthen scent of thawing soil and pine sap. Jonah Grayson worked along the north fence line that morning. Sleeves rolled past his forearms, muscles taut beneath sun-browned skin as he hammered a stubborn post back into place. The forest felt different these days. Quieter, but not in the comforting way he used to know. More like a quiet missing a note in its melody. Since Alara had gone, the cabin had settled into an older kind of silence. The kind Jonah once believed he wanted, yet now found hollow in ways he couldn't articulate. Storm sensed it too. The husky rarely strayed far, always circling close like he feared the world might open beneath Jonah's feet if he wandered too long. As Jonah steadied the post, Storm suddenly froze. His ears pricked sharply, the fur along his spine lifting as if struck by a bolt of memory. He let out a soft, trembling whine, one Jonah hadn't heard since the day she left, then bolted across the yard toward the road. "Storm!" Jonah shouted, startled, dropping the hammer. But the dog didn't slow. He shot across the thawing grass, paws kicking up wet earth, tail whipping with an energy Jonah hadn't seen in weeks. That was when Jonah heard it. An engine. Old, uneven, coughing around the edges like a machine long past its prime but determined to push forward. It was not the polished hum of Vincent's world. It was something older, more human. Jonah wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped toward the road just as a weathered red pickup emerged around the bend. The truck rolled to a stop, dust and meltwater billowing around it. The driver's door eased open, and she stepped out. Alara. No wedding dress this time, no trembling under frost, no elaborate facade. Jeans dusted with road dirt, a soft wool sweater hugging her frame, boots splattered with mud, her hair tied back loosely in the wind. She looked like she belonged to the mountains instead of being swallowed by them. Her shoulders still held a vulnerability, but there was strength beneath it now, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. Storm reached her first. The husky nearly tackled her, whining with pure joy, circling her legs, then leaping up to press his face into her hands as if he needed to confirm she was real. Laughing through tears, Ilara crouched and wrapped her arms around him. Her voice broke as she whispered, "I missed you too, boy." Then Storm did something Jonah didn't expect. He dashed back toward the cabin, snatched something from near the porch, and sprinted back to her. The red ball, dirtied now, well-loved, nearly always within Storm's reach. He dropped it into Ilara's lap with a firm thud and a proud wag of his tail, as though declaring an unbreakable truth. She mattered. She was forgiven. And she was welcome. Jonah stood several yards away, hands resting on his hips, heart thudding like a war drum beneath ribs that felt too tight. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her, the woman he had tried to forget and failed to every single day since she left. Ilara rose, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, her gaze lifting to his with a gentleness that made Jonah's throat constrict. She took a step toward him, and then another, her boots sinking softly into the wet earth. She stopped only a few feet away, close enough for Jonah to see the faint freckles across her nose, the curve of her breath in the cool air, the fear and courage warring quietly in her eyes. "Jonah," she began, her voice steady but filled with something tender, something unguarded. "I didn't come back to ask anything of you. Not forgiveness, not pity, not a place to stay." She paused, swallowing the tremor in her voice. "I came back because when I left, the world felt wrong, too loud, too sharp, too empty. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly why." She lifted her chin, just enough to meet his gaze fully. "I could breathe here, with you, with Storm. And I haven't been able to breathe since I drove away." Jonah's chest tightened, not painfully, but like something long frozen inside him had begun to thaw. He stepped closer, slow as the turning of a season. "Ilara," he murmured, voice low and rough. "I'm not a man who knows what to do with all of this." Her smile was small but warm. "You don't have to know," she whispered. "You just have to let yourself feel it." A breeze stirred the pines above them, sending droplets of melting snow pattering onto their shoulders. Storm circled once, then sat between them, tail sweeping the ground in soft arcs of anticipation, like the dog already knew what came next while the humans struggled to catch up. Jonah finally exhaled, the breath deep and real, like something in him had shifted into place. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, then said the simplest words he could manage. "Come inside," he said gently. "It's getting cold." It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't surrender. It was something else, something like a beginning, fragile and unfinished, but true. Ilara's smile deepened, soft and grateful. She fell into step beside him as they walked toward the cabin, Storm trotting proudly between them, head high, carrying the red ball like a badge of honor. And in the quiet that followed, the kind of quiet that didn't isolate but welcomed, Jonah found he didn't mind the sound of two sets of footsteps beside his own. Maybe love didn't always arrive with grand gestures or perfect timing. Maybe, in places like Sierra Pines, it came instead through small acts. A wooden ramp built with cold hands. A letter folded with trembling fingers. Red ball carried by a loyal heart. Maybe love began exactly here, in the space between a wounded man, a brave woman, and a dog who saw straight through them both. In the quiet mountains of Sierra Pines, Jonah, Ilara, and Storm learned something that many of us forget in the rush of everyday life. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or lightning. Sometimes they come softly, in the shape of a loyal dog, in the courage of a returned heartbeat, in the slow thaw of a wounded soul learning to trust again. And in moments like these, you can feel the gentle hand of God at work, guiding broken people toward places where healing can finally take root. This story reminds us that God often speaks not through loud signs, but through small mercies, a kindness given without asking, a second chance we did not know we needed, a person who shows up when the world feels cold. If we slow down and open our hearts, we may see that the miracles we pray for are already walking beside us. So as you leave this story and return to your own life, may you carry its message with you. May you notice the quiet blessings around you. May you find courage to forgive. And may you believe that no heart is too broken for God to mend. Subjected this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel so these messages can reach others who need them. And may God bless everyone watching this. May He guide your steps, protect your home, and place a small miracle in your path just when you need it most.